Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly Sunday meeting. We are continuing our series on the CBC, the complete blood picture, and today we would be discussing CBCs and WBCs along with a very brief COVID update. We have with us Dr. Nidhi Dhawan, who is the Secretary of IMA and NDB, and also the Associate Medical Director of ENT and the head of the Safety Committee in Shroff Charity Eye Hospital, Daryaganj. And she is going to be carrying forward the session today, just like many other sessions. Without much delay, I would request her to please come forward and conduct this session on CBCs, WCs, and the COVID update.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meenakshi. Have we hit 100 sessions, Dr. Meenakshi? Not yet.
Today is the 96th meeting that we are having. So the 100 sessions would be in a month.
In a month. Oh, God.
So we can, that's why I said a very brief COVID update.
Yeah.
And
I mean, as we hit the 100th, possibly we should emerge from this need to update.
Absolutely. I think we've already emerged from that, but just for the sake of a century, we can.
Yeah. All right. So here goes. Today we are going to be briefly touching about emerging variants, because we hear in the press now, what about BA2 variant and what about Delta Cron? So we are very, very briefly going to touch upon that. But largely we're going to focus on the WBC component of the CBC. Looking at cumulative confirmed cases, we have been so far looking at the weekly reports, which we will look at, but looking at cumulative confirmed cases for the big three, United States, India, and the United Kingdom. So United States has had 79 million cases. India has had 43 million cases. United Kingdom has had 18.5 million, and South Africa has had 3.6 million. For the sake of reference, if you see the population of these countries, you look at UK, the population is 67 million, and at present with Omicron, whether it is BA1 or BA2, 1 in 9 are seropositive. This is the highest that they have ever been in the course of the pandemic. In US, their estimate is that 25% of the population has been infected. In South Korea, this is about 18%. The population of India is 1400 million, which is which is a scale very different from the rest of these countries. And if we look at Indian figures, with what we have heard from Western media and Western press, I can totally understand that they don't understand the scale that we are dealing with. But we seem to have, in terms of proportions, managed the pandemic fairly well. But even if we go by their figures and we say that we've had higher numbers, it would probably do us better in terms of hybrid immunity and the way forward. So looking at daily new confirmed cases, you see US here, you see Kenya, South Africa, India somewhere here, you see Denmark, Singapore, Israel. So a lot of countries are now clustered together, and there are some which are still showing a little uptick. UK, you see Denmark. There is a little bit here. However, especially with UK data, they are saying that at least 50% of the new cases reported are incidental finding, as in they enter the hospital for some other thing and are found to be COVID positive. Look at the countries which had a zero COVID policy, and let's compare that with India. The countries with zero COVID policy, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, right now seems to be really having Australia going up, New Zealand kind of flattening out, but not hitting the baseline as yet. Singapore doing okay. Hong Kong gone up and come down. India comprehensively close to the baseline. So our numbers, whatever they were, have provided some demographic protection to us. Let's look at the countries which are highly vaccinated now, and in comparison to India. Germany, still not hitting the baseline. UK, in many cases, a fourth dose given. Still not coming down, going up. Singapore, very comprehensively, in more than 90% in vaccinated. China, both zero COVID and high vaccination rates. China seems to be having a little bit of an uptick, and India somewhere way down there. I don't really have to elaborate on what's happening here. The comparisons are very stark. There are some things which are working for our country. We can debate about whether we are telling the truth or not. The proof of the pudding is in the eating of it. And whatever the numbers, something is working for the country. If you look at the new confirmed deaths per million population, very busy graph, but focus here on the right end of the graph. If you look at that, South Korea, highly vaccinated, zero COVID policy. If you look at US, now finally coming down, Israel down, India down, South Africa down. So if you were to compare this on February 8th, when we were at the peak of the Omicron wave, and you compare it to March 25th, when we've seen what the numbers are like in the previous slides, there was a little bit concern that South Africa deaths were going up, and is there a delay death button? So there obviously isn't. Israel was a little high, it has come down. UK was nearly 4, it has come to nearly 2. US was about 7.5, it has come to about 2.5. South Korea, which had a zero COVID policy, despite high vaccination, is not really coming down. It is going up. Even now, South Korea was at 0.4 at the peak of Omicron and is now at 7.1. So what has gone wrong with South Korea? I think it's their zero COVID policy which has gone wrong. So there is no opportunity for the population to be educated with the virus, and the emerging variants hence will hit a naive immune system. If you look at this, some others, I don't know whether that is because we are not serotyping enough sequences, or there is really an emergence of some others. But in US also, you see that is beginning to emerge. In South Africa, Delta seems to have reappeared a little bit, or Delta Cron, can't say. But South Korea seems to be 100% Omicron. Israel seems to be 100% Omicron. UK, which does the highest testing, 100% Omicron. Look at how each country's graph may have hit a peak at a different time, but the shape of the graph is the same, irrespective of which country you're looking at. There is a sharp rise. There is a sort of slowing down to hit a plateau. Then there is even this bump. You see this bump is there in all the countries' graph, and then a sharp fall for Delta. And irrespective of which country you're looking at, South Korea, Israel, their numbers may be different. But in terms of percentage of test positives, testing for Delta, it has been the same graph with each country. Let's look at Omicron. Again, sharp rise, flat plateau in all the countries. It's the only difference perhaps is here, and that may be because, as I said, we are seeing now the emergence of something else in India. Vaccines administered, South Korea is way up here. United Kingdom, Israel, US. India, in terms of population covered, this is about boosting, is the lowest. If you look at the cases that we have seen, it is also the lowest among the big giants, despite the others being higherly boosted. So WHO made a statement saying that for the Omicron variant, the mutational profile and the preliminary data indicate that vaccine effectiveness will be reduced against symptomatic disease caused by Omicron, but protection against severe disease is more likely to be preserved. This is a very politically correct statement to make, and probably vaccine hesitancy does need to go. But they also go on to say that there needs to be more data on vaccine effectiveness, particularly against hospitalization, severe disease, and deaths. The NIH, the famous NIH, says despite reduced antibody responses against variants, T cells serve as a second line of defense. This may help to explain why Omicron infections, while easily spread, are likely to lead to severe disease, are less likely to lead to severe disease in fully vaccinated people. So their take is that the vaccine itself will trigger T cell immunity. Given these two statements, if we were to just go by these two statements and we were to go by the cynicism that we see in Western press, then in October, the seropositivity surveys, end of October, beginning of November, that is before Omicron, showed us that in Delhi, we were hitting a nearly 100%, but all over the country, the average was around 85 to 87%, and this included children more than 5 years of age. If we look at share of vaccinated people against COVID as of March 25th, you see South Korea somewhere up here, but their cases are still rising. And my view on this is that it is because of their zero COVID policy. If you remember the graph that we discussed with the CDC mortality morbidity report, and I'll show that graph to you once again. We know that natural infection or a combination of natural infection and vaccination give nearly the same kind of protection. And this protection is about 30 times higher than vaccination alone. So we have that graph, and we'll come to that in a bit. If you look at South Africa, there's still, there's still less than 40%, but their Omicron wave seems to have turned their tide. And that would be, let me show you that graph. See this one. Can you see this graph? So this is when there is no vaccination and no infection. But this here is where everything with natural infection and vaccination is clustered. So this is probably because natural infection has conferred enough immunity, and this is because vaccination alone is not going to work in their favor. Look at how the weekly confirmed map is showing up for the previous week, ending March 25th. India is yellow, less than 10. And Australia, parts of Europe, including United Kingdom, more than 4,000. These are the countries which have had high vaccination rates, high boosting, and demographically, some factors which may have contributed to this. US is now in this zone. Their numbers are coming down, and we can see that. Russia in this zone, parts of Europe, parts of Middle East in this zone. But look at the R numbers. So if you look at the reproductive rate, India is close to 0.5. US, South Africa, somewhere close to 1, which means there is community prevalence, but it is not going up. Israel, nearly 1.5. UK, nearly 1.5, which means that for every infected case, there is potential for 1.5 more infections, which means there is a slow growth, but it's not coming down as yet. So our number less than 1 shows that the pandemic is on its way out in the countries that have that number. Looking at the details of these countries, as of 24th March, UK has had nearly 100,000 cases with a 7-day average of nearly 123,000. The graph still seems to not even be flattening, but they have nearly 50% of these are incidental discoveries. People who came for treatment for something else were found to be COVID positive. US, finally, what we were seeing last week, that there seems to be some doubt that US might go up, even though their 7-day average is at 30 and new cases at 37, it seems to be going closer to the baseline. South Africa, even though the new cases are at 3,500, 7-day average is at 1,200, somewhere close to the baseline. But look at China. Zero COVID, high vaccination, and I don't know what is the reliability, even though the numbers are not very high, numbers for that country, less than 3,000, very huge population. But if you look at what they were at the time of our Delta peak, they managed to dodge it. 127 cases. And today, I mean, for them, from 127 to 2,500 is a biggish number, or maybe even 4,000, 4,500, if we have to go by the actual shape of the graph. It's a biggish number. So zero COVID definitely is not working. India, the only country as of now where the new case load is less than the 7-day average as of 24th of March. Looking at our cardinal states, when you see this zero, you feel really happy. I was telling you that with all the election, post-election rallies, I was really scared and that we should watch Uttar Pradesh. The last week doesn't seem to have translated into increased number of cases. And we may be underreporting, as Western media would have us believe. But it's obviously not causing any problems to the healthcare system. It's not flooding the hospitals. It's not doing much. So we'll go by this. Maharashtra, somewhere close to the baseline, even though slight disparity between new cases and 7-day averages. But if you look at 25th March and 23rd March, you see the numbers are kind of closer on 23rd, and 25th is sort of showing that sawtooth, jagged, going up, coming down kind of picture. Kerala is comprehensively down also, even though I haven't got that graph here. And Delhi, also very close to the baseline, 112 cases with a 7-day average of 104. So the press has been full of some encouraging news, some, and that's a new one for the press, right? Because probably press has been busier dealing with the war and the elections. So you had to look for these, and when you look for them, you find what you look for. Probably that is what has happened. So if you have had Omicron, you're unlikely to catch its rising variant. If the population has had BA1, then BA2 is unlikely to hit. BA2 has 8 unique mutations not found in BA1, but it lacks 13 mutations that BA1 does have. So because of genetic similarity, it is considered a subvariant of Omicron, and hence also immunity will carry over. Does previous infection with BA1 protect against BA2? Yes. And there is a study to say that. If we look at, as I was telling you, October 2021, that was before the Omicron wave, we had a nearly 80% positivity, even in children over 5. And with the adults, this was approaching 90%. So with Omicron, whatever be the numbers, if we have underreported, the numbers would be even higher. But whatever be the numbers, we have had more than 90% seroconversion in our country, with possibly hybrid immunity now coming into play. There are, Nature has reported some articles that say that there are, and this is why I'm saying, I mean, though the Indian government has refuted this, but whatever be the numbers, if what we have done shows up in the world data as what it shows up, we've performed pretty well. We don't have to explain anything to anyone. But even if their estimates are correct, then our seroprevalence is much higher. If you look at the high income countries, that includes United Kingdom, that includes US, that includes Israel, the high income countries have also probably underreported. Upper and middle income countries also probably have underreported. Low and middle income countries, according to them, have severely underreported, which may just be a matter of capturing the data. There is no ulterior motive there, I believe. But if you look at variants, you see that people infected with Omicron pass it more to their close contacts than people infected with Delta. And this is regardless of their vaccination status, which is a blessing in disguise, because if you do get COVID, better it is Omicron, because it is creating an immune response without the pathology in the lungs, without the cytokine storms that we have been seeing. And the reason for that is the bodies are now immunologically educated, whether because of vaccination or because of natural infection. It has nothing to do with per se Omicron, I believe. Vaccine effect for people who have received 3 vaccination doses are more likely to catch Omicron than Delta from somewhere in their household, because vaccines continue to be somewhat effective against Delta, but not so against Omicron, which is the reason why Omicron has taken over, which is the reason why Delta died out. The people who have received 3 vaccination doses are less likely to spread Delta or Omicron to their household members than unvaccinated people, but vaccines are not efficient at blocking transmission of Omicron 100%. So if you were to look at Delta and Omicron in the unvaccinated group, you still find the numbers are somewhat higher than in the vaccinated group. So vaccine does protect. The interesting thing about the Delta Micron or Delta Cron, this was a report from France. And what it implies is, if we look at the N-terminal domain, the charge of the N-terminal domain has changed in Omicron. You see, it is less blue. But in the Delta Cron, this is the same. If you look at the receptor binding domain from Delta to Omicron, it has become more blue. So the immune signature of Omicron is the changes in the receptor binding domain, changing the charge on the receptor binding domain to more positivity, and N-terminal domain to less positivity. The Delta Cron, or the recombinant Delta Omicron, has retained both the changes in the receptor binding domain and the N-terminal domain. So it has the immune signature of both Delta and Omicron. So if somebody has suffered with Delta or with Omicron, the immunity should carry through. If we're looking at transmissibility, if it is not evading the immunity of either, then the transmissibility would necessarily drop. If there is no transmissibility, then the pathology wouldn't be as severe. Now, those are all encouraging things. And the long and short of it is that if we were to thank whatever the gods above for anything, that is that Omicron hasn't caused the kind of disease that we saw in Delta, and that it has done a remarkably good job as a live attenuated vaccine. There are people who will not agree with this. There are people who will say that it is the virus, and it is. But we have seen in pretty large numbers the reports even from CDC saying that, and I'm saying even from CDC, because CDC has been very conveniently ignoring natural immunity. So we have seen that any combination of vaccination with natural immunity does confer immune education and works in the favor of a large demographic profile. Coming to the CBC. So what are neutrophils? Neutrophils are the soldiers. The main functions of neutrophils are that they have phagocytosis for what they see as foreign material. They do release cytokines. They form NETs, neutrophilic extracellular traps, and they degranulate their cytosolic granules. They are produced by the bone marrow and typically last about 60 hours. They are constantly released, and they are the major early responders. They typically die in the process of fighting an infection. But interestingly, most other animals have more lymphocytes. Humans are predominantly neutrophilic, and hence humans are also predominantly inflammatory. It does seem that animals which have been domesticated alongside humans also show a similar blood picture. So dogs are neutrophilic, whereas wolves are lymphocytic. So if you see this little box here, humans have about 60 to 75% of the WBCs as neutrophils, whereas mouse has only 20 to 30%. So the 80 to 70% is lymphocytes. Rat is even lower. Cattle, low. Pigs, low. So lymphocytes are less inflammatory, and neutrophils are fast responders. So we constantly have to work on an anti-inflammatory lifestyle. That seems to be because as we formed urban centers, our surroundings were full of filth and squalor, so that our exposure for fast and quick response was higher, and we evolved to be neutrophilic. Phagocytosis, the first response or the early response, it is triggered by the recognition of pathogen-associated molecular patterns, or the PAMPs. This is helped by opsonization. The opsonization can be done by antibodies or the complement, which sticks to the pathogen.
पानी तो नीचे गिर रहा है उसमें पौधों में डालना है पानी.
किरण जी आपका Mike. So the antibodies in the complement stick to the pathogens, facilitating the phagocytosis. If you see those little black things, this is by actin. The classic phagocytosis is mediated by actin forming a cytoskeletal projection which is stiffer, which recognizes the opsonized bacteria and which then engulfs the bacteria. This is useful for bacteria. But there is another pathway in which clathrin coats the particles, and this is often used for viruses. Now, so molecules that disrupt actin polymerization decrease the phagocytotic ability of neutrophils. Cytokines. So neutrophils release cytokines in almost every family. They are pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, immune regulatory, TNF family, angiogenic, the CCL, CXCL, they have cytokines of every family. But these are in much lower quantities than the classic cytokine producing immune signature cells, the macrophages and the lymphocytes. So they do contribute to angiogenesis, hematopoiesis, wound healing, autoimmunity, neoplastic diseases, but their major role is in local acute inflammation and in linking innate and adaptive immune arms. This has been so far the dark side of the moon. This has been something that hasn't been studied too much, but it is of note that we have IL family here, pro-inflammatory IL-1, IL-1 beta, IL-6, that we have anti-inflammatory IL-1 RA, TGF, tumor growth factors, beta-1 and beta-2. So we have, and immune regulatory, so we have cytokines of every family. There are nearly 120 cytokines, and we can't, and there might be more, and we can't know everything about everything. So we would just focus on the ones which we know are significantly acting from this immune arm. If you look at what happens in a neutrophilic response, either it can go into non-resolving inflammation, or it can go into increased host defense. And this is what will result in either the body moving towards an acute cytokine storm-like stage or a resolved, dealt with that infection kind of stage. The antimicrobial response of neutrophils is largely phagocytosis. It also releases antimicrobial polypeptides through the degranulation, which causes those bacteria to be killed. And it forms NETs, the neutrophilic extracellular traps, which trap the foreign material in the extracellular space. The mediators, all those mediators that I showed in the wheel, can either target your endothelial cells and cause endothelial activation with increased vascular permeability. And the neutrophils have to squeeze through very small spaces, 0.1 micron spaces, and their own size is about 10 microns. So they have to squeeze through a space which is 100th of their size, which is the reason they have evolved to have that multilobate nucleus, so that the nucleus can squeeze through in parts. They do work on monocytes and macrophages through various chemokines, granular proteins and cytokines to recruit them, to increase their antimicrobial activity, and also to increase further from monocytes and macrophages the secretion of cytokines and chemokines. The dendritic cell, which is the classic cell which connects the innate and the adaptive arms, is also recruited by neutrophils. The neutrophils not just recruit the dendritic cells, but they also increase their maturation and increase again the production of cytokines and chemokines from dendritic cells. All these soluble mediators and cytokines from the antigen presenting cell-like neutrophils. There are some neutrophils which work like antigen presenting cell or APCs, and hence they cause both T cell proliferation, T cell suppression, as well as T cell recruitment. That depends on which cytokines, if you see here, A and B, which cytokines are working at what level. There are both Th1 and Th2 activation patterns, and there is an overall inhibition of T cell proliferation if the anti-inflammatory cascade takes over. So there are the inflammatory macrophages which could be present, or as the time progresses, as the body comes out of that acute phase, the pro-repair macrophages which come into play. The pro-repair or anti-inflammatory macrophages are IL-10 rich. The time profile of neutrophilic response and its interaction with macrophages, the first 1 to 2 hours is for arresting any bleeding if such is happening, recruiting the platelets. So there is a sudden spike of platelets. The next is the window of about 5 days where there is local inflammation. There is swarming of neutrophils to that local spot. There's phagocytosis, and there is trying to clear the pathogen and formation of pus if it is an extremely localized thing. The pus, interestingly, is white because the neutrophils have died and are part of that pus material. Over the next 2 to 3 weeks, the anti-inflammatory macrophages begin to rise. The cell proliferation and repair takes place, and extracellular matrix is deposited. And in the longer term, remodeling with IL-4 and T regulator cells begins to happen, and there is wound contraction so that the scarring is least. Now, the classic neutrophilic functions are degranulation, cytokine release, phagocytosis, and working through the oxidative burst to kill the bacteria. But there are newer studies which have shown neutrophils have a far-reaching, much greater role to play in pathology and in physiology. So if we look at the kind of chemical signatures the neutrophils have, there is CD177, which is increased in inflammatory conditions particularly. There is OLF-M4+, which is less effective in clearing bacteria, but is triggered in viral responses. So these are different classes of neutrophils which come into play and which in a nuanced dance are helping the body deal with what it sees could be harming the body. If you look at the cytokine storm, which has been the arrow that kills in COVID, let's say, then ferritin, D-dimer, lactate, dehydrogenase, ALT, NLR, ESR, cytokines, and C-reactive protein, they're all raised. And neutrophils have a large part to play in this pathology. This is a slide that I think it would be good to have a screenshot of. I'll leave it on for a bit. If you look at what is the normal range and what has been the cutoff range in COVID, And the last column is the number of studies in which this has been found. So this is all supported by science and supported by studies. Ferritin is raised from the usual 18 to 350 to more than 400. D-dimer is raised from 250 to 500 to more than 1000. And please do look at the units, because they're different for everything. Lactate dehydrogenase, again, nearly 4 times the normal levels. C-reactive protein, we all know so much about C-reactive protein. ALT, cytokines, NLR. With seeing the CBC in COVID times, the first thing that my eye goes to is the TLC, that's a total count. And then I look at the neutrophil and the lymphocyte. And if I find that these 3 parameters are out, my antennae are alerted that, I'm dealing with something which needs more attention. So there are clues in every number. And there are, you will find what works for you. But for me, that's the first alerting sign that something is wrong. And I have not found anywhere where that, where that feeling has been wrong. So this is something which, if you have any CBCs, we can actually look at those CBCs. We can have people project their own numbers also. ESR, we all know that ESR can be raised even after a meal, even during menstrual cycle. But the rise that we see in acute inflammatory conditions and in cytokine storms and in conditions like COVID is nearly 4-fold. So, brief recap, the PAMPs are recognized by the pattern recognition receptors in antigen presenting cells, which activates the antigen presenting cells, which leads to cytokine release, which activate T helper cells, and which releases cytokines from the T cells. Now, the IL-1, which causes fever, is the marker of innate inflammatory response. And if this goes on to produce IL-2 from the second responders, the macrophages and the lymphocytes and the monocytes, then in case of viruses, the IL-2 response predominates through interferon arm. These are largely for intracellular pathogens, and they form cytotoxic T cells, T lymphocytes, which then create the cascade for elimination of the virus. If it is an IL-4 predominant response, which is found in bacteria, if you remember the TLR4 receptors that we talked of in RBCs, the IL-4, the TLR responses recognize specific bacterial antigens. This is largely for extracellular antigens. These promote B cells, which cause opsonization of the bacteria, which cause neutralization of the bacteria and elimination. So this is for extracellular pathogens. Now, if we have both IL-4 and IL-5, which are seen in case of helminths and allergic responses, then we find that B cells, eosinophils, and basophils are all promoted. This is very, very simple and very, very, large view of what is going on. But histamine is released, and so there are all features of allergy that you find. Allergy is when in the absence of a usual trigger. So if you don't have an helminth, but IL-4 and IL-5 are produced, say in response to the peanut or the pollen, the response is the same. There is something called the Red Queen hypothesis in immunology. The Red Queen hypothesis, so if you have read the Alice in Wonderland, Red Queen is the one which says to Alice that, you see, you have to run very fast just to stay in place. So the Red Queen hypothesis of immunology is that any biological entity evolves to beat what can eliminate it. So the bacteria will evolve to evade, or viruses will evolve to evade our immunity. And counter to that, as our immune system gets educated, it will evolve to further eradicate these mutations. So it's it's the fight between the deer and the leopard. The deer will run faster, the leopard will run faster, and they will keep biologically getting better to serve their own purpose of survival. So the immune evasion that certain pathogens develop is for that reason. The bacteria, some bacteria have evolved to become intracellular. Chlamydia, Salmonella, we saw. Some fungi and helminths secrete proteases that lyse the cytokines that recognize them. Some viruses and helminths have evolved to produce their own anti-inflammatory cytokines, which look so similar to our anti-inflammatory cytokines that our cells get deceived to turn off our immune system. And the biggest one, the viruses mutate. So there is immune memory failure. If we look at some very typical counts, अगर अभी सर कर रहे होते ना, तो सर कहते हैं आप एक एक करके अपने हाथ उठाओ और let us see के कौन क्या बोल रहा है. So if you want to do that, we can totally do that. But if I see, say, this CBC, if I look at the WBC count, it is normal. If I see the neutrophil count, it is normal. The lymphocyte count, it is normal. The monocyte count is normal. Eosinophil count is normal. So if you look at a CBC, look at in the first layer, look at the hemoglobin, look at the TLC, and look at the DLC. In some conditions, we want to see the platelets, but not in all. If you look at this one, for instance, this is showing 3.0 as against a normal of 4. So the TLC is less. Now, if I were to see the next one, neutrophils, less. If I see leukopenia with neutropenia, then certain conditions should come into my mind. And I'm going to come to that in a bit. But the normal neutrocyte lymphocytic ratio has been found to be varying between 0.7 to 3.5. But if you see it higher than 3.5, you should think of COVID. And remember that up to 11,000 per microliter are normal counts. However, it depends, and you must do serial counts. It depends on what the baseline count for the patient was. Again, 5.4 normal, but here the platelet count is just borderline low. You look at lymphocytes, low. Monocytes, high. Eosinophils, high. This is likely, I don't know because I don't have the reference, but this is likely to be a COVID patient. You must also see the reference point of the history. Now, this is a 5-month infant with fever and cough. A 5-month infant with fever and cough having a WBC count of 14.6. Definitely high, acute infection. We expect a neutrophilic response, but the neutrophils are 30%. Lymphocytes are 65%. This is the immune signature of a disease. This is pertussis. So the reference point of the history will give us the clue, and the CBC numbers will confirm our suspicions. The eye sees what the mind is aware of. So we must constantly keep learning new and new things. In that Red Queen hypothesis, we must also evolve. If we look at this, total count, 11,700. Neutrophils, 31. This is borderline high. I said 11,000 would be normal. Neutrophils low, lymphocytes high. Platelets high. Likely to be some viral disease. This could be infectious mononucleosis. I don't know. Could be. WBC count high. Platelet normal, but on the higher side. Neutrophils high. Lymphocytes normal. An acute bacterial infection, perhaps. Likelihood, because the hemoglobin has also fallen, could be typhoid. So these are normal reference ranges. I would say that, there are clues everywhere. If we are aware of them, we will look for them. And I think we just need to broaden our view and start looking at numbers. Maybe we can have, participation where everybody presents one or two very classic, typical findings, and we see how we can become more aware of the CBC. I think that's it for me.
Brilliant discussions today, Dr. Nidhi. So we are just waiting for, the floor is open for questions. If anyone would like to ask, I believe Dr. Arora wants to ask a question. Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Nidhi, I think that I would take this cognizance of 2 slides. In one slide, you said pertussis because of the high TLC. But in infants, it's already high.
Agreed.
It can be even up to 19,000, 18,000.
Agreed.
So by looking at the WBC count, we can't say it is an infection, in fact, bacterial infection.
Agreed. Agreed.
And second, you are saying a case of COVID, where NLR was not more than 3. It was a 53 something neutrophil and 23 lymphocytes. So in COVID, it is usually, as I understand, Dr. KK.
Ulta, yes.
Yes. So these are good things.
Agreed. Sir, in COVID, what happens is that the response becomes largely lymphocytic. So if you find that this ratio is getting disturbed, you should start thinking. That's why I said it's probably COVID, because I see that reversal of response in any acute.
Day 2, day 3 of COVID is what it could be.
So those are the early trends. And that's what I said, that, you know, if you have an acute infection, you are expecting a neutrophilic response. But in COVID, we find that the lymphocytic response takes over.
Madam, I like to comment here as well. See, it is true that in viral infections, lymphocytes are high and TLCs, neutrophils are not so high and low. Okay. Because that all the what we have been doing these activities during COVID period, that was the reason at that time we were thinking all lymphocytes are high and we are expecting a viral infection. So that could be COVID. So that was the reason primary why we are saying COVID. Otherwise, any viral infection, we have lymphocytes high and this neutrophils bit low.
And if the ratio is, that the neutrophils are significantly higher, despite COVID symptoms, I mean, corona-like symptoms, then we are thinking of COVID.
That's
yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Nidhi. Effect of dehydration on cell counts.
Sir, the hematocrit will change.
Even
the hematocrit will change, but the TLC will not be so affected. ESR will change.
So the formula is hemoglobin is 3 times the hematocrit. The hematocrit is 3 times the hemoglobin. And if that is increased, then that is a sign of dehydration. That's sir's formulae जो याद आते हैं the के.
Dr. Meenakshi and Dr. Nidhi, you said if anybody wants to share, and then see 8th May is International Thalassemia Day, so I'll be busy on that day. But if you ask me on 15th May, next Sunday, I can present on thalassemia. I think that for the physicians and all that.
It would be very nice, sir.
So 15th May, nice. Doing the thalassemia.
Done, sir. I'm saying okay, Meenakshi, is that okay?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I missed your last Sunday RBC. I was not here. So I'll see on the YouTube.
That's very interesting.
Madam, why the dogs and humans are neutrophilic and why the other animals are heterophilic?
So that's what I was saying, that evolutionarily, as we urbanized, our surroundings were full of triggers. They were dirty, they were full of bacteria, and we were exposed to things that we needed to fight. So evolutionarily, human beings developed a neutrophilic predominance. Whereas non-domesticated animals have largely been in the wild, which has diluted exposures, and hence they don't need to quickly respond to the environment and have stayed lymphocytic. जो हमारे साथ domesticate हुआ, वो भी neutrophilic हो गया. So dogs are neutrophilic, whereas wolves are lymphocytic. This is very interesting. This is something that I found out yesterday, which was very interesting.
But one thing I like to clarify from you, whether only pet dogs and difference in pet dogs and wild dogs, any difference?
The wild dogs we are assuming to be wolves, sir. Dogs per se are urban.
Even otherwise, say buffalo, cattle, I'm just asking you. The difference between
cattle का सर थोड़ा सा वो है, cattle का kind of equal है, 35 to 50 है neutrophils, और हमारा 50 to 70 है.
मेरा एग्जैक्ट क्वेश्चन ये है कि अगर जो पेट एनिमल है वही एनिमल अगर वाइल्ड में जब होता है तो उसमें डिफरेंस है कि नहीं, ये
मेरे को, so I'm not an expert on this, but what I feel is that evolution में जो हमारे साथ domesticate हुए वो एक evolutionary profile बन गई है. तो अब whether they are in the wild or they are domestic, they will have the same blood chemistry. I mean, that is my reading of the thing. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting point कि जो natural response है, जो natural chemistry है, वो lymphocyte predominant है, और lymphocytes जो हैं वो acute inflammation में आते नहीं हैं. So वो इसलिए था because there was no need to respond to anything. Whenever that response was needed, we could mount it, and there was no need in the everyday life to mount that response. But as we urbanized, we had everyday needs. We were living in filth and squalor. Human beings were living in clusters which exposed them to more antigens and to more bacteria, and hence we evolved to have a neutrophilic response.
And madam, how to predict from the neutrophilic and lymphocytic ratio?
How to
predict the disease?
Predict.
How to predict? Yes.
The neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, as we said, कि अगर 3 से नीचे है तो वो normal है. अगर वो 3 से ऊपर जा रहा है, which means that the neutrophils are rising and the lymphocytes are falling, and this neutrophil are more than 3 times the lymphocytes. So जो आप देख रहे हो, either you can see the DLC component in absolute numbers, or you can see the DLC component in percentages. If you see that the neutrophils are more than 3 times the lymphocytes, then in COVID times, as Dr. Arora pointed out, it is likely to be COVID, but this is a signature for septicemia. It is a signature for acute inflammatory conditions like pancreatitis, so it's an immune signature for worse prognosis, because it shows that the neutrophils are going rampant. It's a signature of impending cytokine storm and immune exhaustion.
I think one thing more I can add. If we have hemoglobin low and lymphocytes are high, we can expect there is some chronic infection going on.
Yes. Yes. Sir, in some acute infections also, like in typhoid, hemoglobin will start falling.
No, but still, that in typhoid you see fever and all these symptoms are there.
Yeah.
And it is mostly asymptomatic, especially in tuberculosis.
Yes. So
are there any chronic or low, even say HIV, just predominantly, you will see the hemoglobin coming down and lymphocyte going high, and there is no apparent symptom over there. You can expect some chronic infection going over there.
Agreed.
Madam, how can we rely on the laboratory investigation report?
How can we rely on the investigation report? अगर सर आपको लगता है कि वो reliable नहीं है तो दूसरे लैब से करा लो, मैं तो यही कहती हूँ.
I think the most important is clinical sense. That is the history and clinical sense. That is the most important.
So if your lab reports are corroborating your clinical sense, they are reliable. If they are going against it, repeat it. If they still go against it and you still are convinced कि आप correct हो, तो दूसरे lab से करा लो.
And is it the manual reporting is better than automatic or vice versa?
Meenakshi, you want to answer that? Because I don't know.
I didn't hear the question
correctly. Is manual recording of cell counts better or automatic?
Of course, there can be some errors in the automatic one. Little bit of so I think yes, if you have a manual one that is being done, that is I personally, so again, everyone has their own view on this. I think that the automated ones, they usually, but then वो बहुत minor सा एक change आता है, and the manual recording, if it is done by a good pathologist, of course that will be better. And if it is just a an intern pathologist or something, then you cannot rely on the manual one. So it's anybody's game. It depends on. So again, I think the clinical history and the signs, symptoms, whatever you see, those are the most important clue, and they should be already the report should be just confirming the diagnosis that you have in mind. So it should fall into place with that. So agar usme, so we see so many of these automated reports that report a little bit of MCV, 2-3%, not even 2-3%, a few 0.7%, 0.8% jo upar aata hai, then it gets highlighted and the patient gets so worried ki ye mera abnormal hai and everything. So that's again the clinical picture is what is important.
Well, I like to comment over this. See, as far as platelets are concerned, you may see low platelet in automatic cell counter. Especially we have seen in the dengue cases, if it is your suspecting, get it done manually as well. That's the number one. Number two, what we have seen in many our patients, say thalassemia or splenectomized patients, that TLC is exorbitantly raised. It's very, very high. And they give it the manual report. It's say around between the range or slightly higher than that. So sometimes when you are not comfortable with this automatic, though usually automatic are okay, but in special conditions we have seen platelets low and this TLC raised in few conditions. Then we ask for the corrected report.
So then, sir, the bottom line still says that the reports are only going to confirm your clinical sense.
That is most important.
And if they don't, then get it repeated. Matlab, clinically, you have to figure out what you're looking for.
And secondly, if you're still not convinced with the reports, ask for a peripheral smear.
Yes.
Because that will be more correct by the.
Yes. I mean, with a normal hemoglobin also, peripheral smear can reveal some form of anemia.
Thank you, madam.
So I think on that note, we can end the show if there are no more questions. If there's anyone who would like to ask anything, I think raise your hand or ask the question right now. Else, I think we may end the show. There's someone who's unmuted. Would you like to say something? Galaxy J7 से जो हैं आप कुछ बोलना चाहते हैं? Okay, I don't think any more questions for today.
Eosinophil, I can just add one more thing.
Yeah, sure.
Eosinophil less than say 10%, 6, 7 times, slightly raised, of no significance. That can be even temporary because even infections as well. So some people do start this the Vanosent form or whatever heterozyte type with the say 8%, 9%. It's not required unless it is.
It's not required. I agree. Sir, but I also feel like again, आपकी उसी बात को आगे बढ़ाते हुए that clinically you have to see heterozyte should not be added at that point.
Yes. You can give anthelmintic, that is okay, no problem.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you everyone for joining in. On that note, we'd like to end the session today. So we'll be back next week with a few things COVID and more things CBC. We would be continuing our discussions on the complete blood picture. It was a great session today and a lot of insight into the most common reporting that is done amongst us medicos. So thank you, Dr. Nidhi, for all your efforts and doing this with us every week. We'll be back next